That's all that's important.
Yeah. Albeit sore, but I'm still alive. So.
I was listening to Burl discuss about her case, which I really don't know that much about, and I don't think you do either. But it's interesting. I was reading something kind of related to that about the best evidence rule as it relates to notes, mortgages, and assignments, and problems that homeowners deal with is that, the note or the mortgage or the assignment are rebuttable because they're presumptive evidence. And unless you object to them, then they can stand. But what the real evidence of the debt would be is actually the payment. So like the wire transfer from the bank. And so if you argue that the underlying transaction between the parties stated in the documents never took place, you can actually argue that. And they would have to produce actual evidence. So the note on the underlying transaction, the underlying transaction is the debt, not the note. The debt exists not because of the note, but because Party A put money into the hands of Party B, who accepted it. And the debt arises regardless of whether or not a note was executed. The note is evidence of the debt, and it is presumptive evidence that there was an underlying transaction, the amount of the note. The underlying transaction is therefore the payee putting money into the hands of the homeowner, who is the payor. So when do you object to that? Well, you have to remember you have to raise an objection, and then the burden of proof falls on the other party instead of you, the homeowner, if you're being foreclosed on. And so the objection holds the bank's feet to the fire to prove their case. And, there's really no reason for you not to object. It shows the underlying transaction stated between the parties and proffered by the bank. And you're arguing that it never occurred. And there's two ways you can do that. You can either do it with the hearsay rule, which is an objection because the document being used to establish the truth in the matter is implied that there was an underlying transaction. So, the note, the mortgage, and assignment are only hearsay. They're not fact evidence. But you could also use the objection that the underlying transaction, using those documents, the transaction lacks foundation, and hold them to the best evidence rule. So the best evidence rule of the underlying transaction would be the actual canceled check or wire transfer receipt showing the payment and implied acceptance of the money used to fund the loan or purchase a mortgage. Anything less is not admissible evidence unless the objection is overlooked or waived. So it's important to raise your objections, and this applies both in federal court, and you have to check your local rules, but I know in the state of Florida it applies in Florida court. And it's not a technical matter, it's a matter of evidence. The best evidence rule is set forth in Federal Rules of Evidence 1001, provides that where a writing is offered as evidence, a copy or other secondary evidence of its content will not be received in place of the original document unless an adequate explanation is offered for the absence of the original. Federal Rules of Evidence 1002 through 1008. So think of where they do the lost note affidavit in a complaint. If you object to that up front, then you can strike it where they can't even use that. Public records authentication is proved through Federal Rule 1005, and under Rule 1006, voluminous writings, recordings, or photographs which cannot be conveniently examined in court may be presented in the form of a chart, summary, or calculation. Of course, admissibility of a summary depends on the admissibility of the underlying documents. In order to use the summary, timely written notice is required with proof filed in the court. Adverse parties must have sufficient time to investigate and inspect the underlying records and summaries. in Federal Rules of Evidence 1008 set forth the situations where the court determines admissibility and where the jury determines factual issues such as the existence of a document, its contents, and the content's accuracy. The best evidence rule arose during the days when a copy was usually made by a clerk or worse, by a party to the lawsuit. Courts generally assumed that if the original was not produced, there is a good chance of either the scrivener's error, the copyist in the old days, or fraud. There is always a danger of a party questioning a document, so it's important to remember that unless you have a stipulation to the contrary or your document fits one of the exemptions listed in the statute, you must be ready to produce originals of any documents involved in your case or to produce evidence of why you cannot. So by objecting to anything they put in there, even if it's an original note, you can object to that because it's presumptive evidence. It's not the actual fact evidence of the underlying transaction. How about that?